In my previous introduction to PowerShell video, I showed you some basics on how you can work with some of the commandlets and objects and things like that. We did some examples. Here's another real-world example. Let's say I wanted to get a list of all my firewall rules in Windows and all the ports that are being used for those rules. And you could also, maybe you also want to look at the IP addresses, but let's just look at a basic example with just those two, right? So the first thing is there is a command to look at your firewall rules. It's get net firewall, let's see, rule, right? And we can look at what's in there. So we'll do get member, right? Because that shows us what all the properties are that we can work with, right? So there's all the stuff we can work with in a firewall rule, right? So it has things like the name of the firewall rule. There is a property called instance ID, which is basically how you connect all these different elements of rules together, right? There has to be a common thread. Think of like a database with foreign keys, that kind of thing. And then there's also a commandlet for get your net firewall. Let's see if we can find it here. Port filter. There we go. So again, we can pass it into get member. That'll tell us what some of the properties are, right? So, and here you can see we have the local port, the protocol, the remote port, right? So TCP or UDP, and then what the port numbers are on both sides of the rule. So useful stuff, right? Now this is great, right? That we could have access to this stuff. Just to show you an example, I'm just going to copy and paste here so you don't have to wait for me to type. But we're just going to get the name and the instance ID of all of our rules that we have, right? So there's all my firewall rules. There's a whole bunch of them in here, right? A lot of them are these UIDs, but here's some other ones, right? So that's a bunch of stuff, a bunch of rules, but this doesn't really tell you what the rule does, right? It doesn't tell you what port numbers are associated with those rules. So the command, of course, we just looked at a second ago to get that, right, is net firewall port filter. And the parameters that we have available, and again I'm going to use format table, right, because it gives me a nice table format, makes it easier to read this stuff. But there's all my rules, and you can see here I outputted the instance ID so you can see that they are the same, right? So that's the common thread that I could use to connect the rules with the port filters, right? But now how do I connect these? So right now what I essentially would have is two separate objects, right, that happen to have something in common. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I think for me, probably an easy way to do this is a for each loop, right? And I'm sure there's easier ways to do it, but this is how I would do it. So we'll for each rule in, and I'm going to get my get net firewall rules. That's going to get me all of my rules. And then I want to do another loop. But inside this rule, I'm going to get my ports. So get port in, what is it? Get dash net firewall port filter. But here's the thing is I don't want to get everything. I only want to get it where it's equal to a certain value, right? So as an example, here's a bunch of, let's look at, oops, I always do that. So let's say just to test this, I want to get this rule right here, right? So there's the instance ID for the rule. How would I actually select that, right? So it would be get, let me put a space in here so it'll give me my recommendations here. Here we go. Get not firewall port filter. I'm going to go into where object, and then it's $_ oops, we want instance ID is equal to that value, right? And that should work, right? This should give us just that rule, and there it is. It only outputs that rule. It happens to be UDP on port 2177, right? So I want to use this exact same syntax. The only minor difference is, number one, this has to be in parentheses, right? And number two, this is not going to be hard-coded. I have to use the rule.instance ID, right? So rule.instance ID. That's going to get me just the instance ID of the current rule that I'm iterating through in this loop. So I'll close my parenthesis, and that puts me inside my loop. So now inside this loop, I have access to all the properties of rule, which was the output of getNet firewall rule, and all the properties of port for the objects that are associated with just that rule, right? This is not a very efficient way to get this, right? But it'll work, right? I'm sure there's actually another syntax that you could use, but I don't want to cover that quite yet. The other piece here is, and we learned about this in the previous, in my previous example, is I want to get, to format this as a nice pretty table, I want to probably get a list of all these different rules and be able to format it. So I'm just going to create an array to do that, right? Just a list, right? So I'm going to get that in a list. And then the other piece is in here, I have all these, I want to create an object for each one of these and just add it to that list. So it'll be a list that's a collection of objects that'll all have the same properties. So we saw how to do this before. Basically, I'm just going to call it this rule, right? And that's where I'm going to create my object. And then I'm going to create a property for each one of these parameters that I'm interested in, right? There's more properties that I could add in here to this object, but I'm just going to get the display name, the instance ID, the protocol port, and remote port, and that's all I care about, right? So if I run this, that should create my object. This is going to take a while for it to run, but I'm going to run it, let it go, and then come back and see if I have that object. Okay, so that ran, and let's see if I have that object now, my firewall rules. It's gonna have a lot of stuff in it. Like I said, this is probably not the most efficient way to do this. Oh, and I forgot one step, right? I waited and forgot. I have to add each one of these objects, right? After I create the object, I got to add it to firewall rules. So plus equals $this rule. So I got to run it one more time. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay. So that finished. So now I should have some stuff in firewall rules. There it is, right? And just like before, I'd probably be able to pipe this into format table, and I should be able to list some of the properties that I'm interested in. So I'm just going to copy and paste these to make this faster. So I'm just going to show a couple of the properties, right? Now here's the thing is, I'm just showing some basic stuff here. One of the things I probably want to add to this is to be able to group by, right? It's kind of one of the cool features for format table, and I can group it by the display name, right? Because display name is going to be the rule. So we have a rule that may contain multiple port filters, right? So I can basically, for each of my display names, show all the different port filters that might exist. So if I run that, and that works, right? So now I can, some of them have more than one, some only have one line, right? But now I could also add a where object, right? So if I want to hone in on just a certain type of service, right? Or a certain rule. So let's see, maybe we could do remote desktop, right? Every system has remote desktop. So we'll use where object $_ display name. Is like remote desktop. So that should just give us the ones that have something to do with remote desktop. I'm just going to clear the screen down here at the bottom to get rid of some of that clutter. We'll move this up so we can see more of it. And we'll run that. So now we can just see, it's a shorter list now. It's only remote desktop. So I have one called user mode, which is allowing port 3389, another one for UDP 3389, another one that's TCP any, right? Another one for port 3387 and 3392. So that's all my rules associated with remote desktop. So you can see here we kind of worked with using some of the techniques you saw in the previous video. We're able to piece some of this together to answer, a basic question about our firewall rules.